Steve, for the kind words. I think other than my mother, you're the only person that read the history chapter.
Oh.
But I thank you for that.
Call her and
Exactly. Well, it's terrific to be here. Let me thank you for coming. I'm just going to be one of many people that will be on your menu today. Hopefully I can tee up some of the conversation. My goal is to provoke you a little bit, to gently challenge you to think about some things that maybe you're already thinking about or maybe not. But not just to stir the pot and to be difficult. I hope to leave you with some ideas, maybe some resources that can help you with some of the things that we'll be talking about. I want to thank Steve again for your friendship and inviting me, and Scott Ray, who's not here yet, later, and Greg, where are you? Over here for friendship, which dates back many years with the Service Master connection with Bill Pollard and so forth, so it's terrific to be here. And I also want to thank Philip for picking me up at the airport and bringing me over this morning. You know, when you travel a lot, as I do and many of you do, and give talks, you end up in hotels, you kind of forget where you're waking up and what you're doing, and someone very graciously picks you up. So Philip asked me this morning, he said, "So David, since you sent us your press photo, have you lost some weight?" And I responded, "Well, no, I don't really think so, but I guess that's sort of a backhanded compliment," and I thanked him for that. Well, I gave a talk at Millsaps College. This is being filmed, I shouldn't have said that. At a college in Jackson, Mississippi that'll go nameless. And I got in late at night, and I was kind of tired, and the professor who was hosting me, she very graciously was there to pick me up. I don't know, it was 10:30 at night. And she looks up, and she says, "Professor Miller?" And I say, "Yes." She goes, "You're not as fat as you look in your photo." Philip was a lot nicer. So anyway, it's a little warm. If you don't mind, let me sort of strip down and let's have a little chat. So you've gotten to learn a little bit about me through the kind introduction that Steve just gave. I'd like to learn a little bit about you first, if you don't mind. Let's do some sort of show of hand things. So how many of you are ordained clergy, ordained pastors? Show of hands. Sort of like the vast majority of you. Great. And how many of you who are ordained clergy are pastors in what I would kind of call a startup church, a church plant? So a smaller amount, not surprising, but okay. And how many of you are on I guess the default would be an established church that's been around for a while? The rest, hands there. And how many of you are on a multi-staff church? So it's sort of group. Terrific. All right. Let me ask another question. How many of you who are clergy, again, it's most of you here, how many of you, as part of your day-to-day routine of being a pastor, do hospital visits for some members of your congregation who are sick? Show of hands. I think that's virtually everybody. Any pastor not do a hospital visit? Just checking. Maybe you're getting tired raising your hands. How many of you visit someone who might be, I hate the phrase, but the phrase is shut-in, someone who's disabled or elderly and not able to get to church anymore? How many do that? I'm hoping it's the same amount again. How many of you do visits to your congregation's places of work? 7, 8, 9, 10. About 10 or 11 of you. Well, terrific. This then is maybe a self-selected audience that's much different than the national profile. When I give talks at different conferences and organizations to clergy, and by the way, I'm ordained as well, so some of the critique I'm about to make of the church writ large, I'm pointing the finger at me too, just so you understand. The majority of hands, there could be 50, 100, 200 people in the room, and usually only 1 or 2 hands go up as to how often a pastor goes to someone's place of work. And I don't care whether it's a white-collar job, real fancy up on the 40th floor, or whether it's sort of a manual labor job where someone's earning hourly wages. It tends to be a low number. And I have a hunch my buddy Doug Spada will pick up on some of this with some of the things that he and I care deeply about. And actually, I want to say hello again. It's great. You're going to be in a real treat for what Doug says this afternoon. He and I have been digging in the trenches for a good decade plus in this space. But that's one of the most powerful things I think clergy can do, is to visit their parishioners at their place of work. And we might come back as to why that is. So let me tell you another straw poll I do when I speak to a lot of corporate folks. In the bio, you might have picked up that I do a lot of speaking at different public events of business people. And often in those settings, I have no idea what their religious identity is or their spiritual orientation or interests. I have no idea what they are. It's just sort of a slice of life. And I asked the question, for those of you who are members of a church or a synagogue or something, how many of you, if you have a problem in your marriage is tumbling apart, would call up your pastor for help? And virtually every hand goes up, a lot of them. And I ask again, those of you that are a member of some worship community of some type, if you have a substance abuse problem or maybe depression or you're starting to drink too much, whatever it might be, how many you would go to your pastor for guidance? And about half the hands go up, a few less, but still many do. And then I asked the question, which actually you teed up, and we didn't orchestrate this. And I said, if some of you have a business dilemma, sort of a moral, ethical component to something you're struggling with at work, like two sets of books that you referred to, how many of you would call your pastor and say, hey, I need to talk to you about something? What do you think the answer is to that last question? 0, and sometimes I get laughter. Wow, like what an indictment of us. Think of all the theological training we have in this room. And they don't expect us to know the answer for net present value or some sophisticated analytical deal. They just want wisdom. They just want prayers. They just want to know that you're walking alongside them. It saddens me as I see these two trends going on. On the one hand, there's this growing interest, and there's a whole bunch of generational data that supports this as well. There's growing interest, particularly amongst the millennials, who want to go work for places where they could bring their whole value set, bring their whole self to work. So there's a desire to have an integrated, holistic life. And at the very same time, we, the church, and again, not picking on you, because my guess is you're here because you think differently about this, but the church writ large is standing on the sidelines. There was a survey done, now it's maybe a good 10, 12 years ago, and I don't know if the data still holds, but it surveyed people in the Chicago area from a variety of different religious traditions, mostly Christian, evangelical, Catholic, mainline, and a couple Jewish synagogues. And they asked the question, when was the last time you heard your pastor, your rabbi, your priest preach or give a homily on the workplace, on the work world? Less than 1 in 10 could remember the last time they had that they heard someone talk about the workplace. And the few sermons that you do hear preached about the workplace are often sort of scolding, derogatory sermons about all those greedy people in big business making way too much money. So there's that we inadvertently send the church a message that your work really doesn't matter to God. What matters is, are you a Sunday school teacher? Are you in the deacon? Are you a board of elders? Are you serving coffee? Are you in the building committee? That's what matters. Church is about Sunday, not Monday. So we have an ecclesial problem here, an ecclesiastical issue. How do we think about church? What is church? What does it mean to do church? What does it mean to be the church? Now, I come out of the Reformed tradition. I know we all have our different accents. In the Reformed tradition, so I'm a Calvinist, a Presbyterian, the Reformed tradition has this wonderful image to me of gathering and scattering, gathering and scattering. So we gather once a week on Sundays to praise and worship God, classic Westminster Confession stuff, and to equip the saints, to equip ourselves, isn't that our title? Preparing the saints for whole life ministry, to go back into the game on Monday. So what's it mean to be a ditch digger? What's it mean to be a secretary? What's it mean to be a CEO? What's it mean to be a hostile M&A lawyer? What's that look like? And we equip them. So we gather, we scatter, we gather, we scatter. I think too often the church, writ large, focuses more on the gathering moment and putting on a darn good show Sunday and forget what happens when people go back into the game on Monday. And in fairness to all clergy, I think being a pastor these days has to be one of the hardest jobs in the world. One of the most amazing and beautiful jobs. But, I mean, who else has to compete with Sunday morning soccer? I mean, think about the models that used to exist when I was growing up and some of you were growing up, it was just kind of a given. Of course you go to church. You weren't even competing. Nothing else happened. Now there's travel teams and I mean, everything has changed, the model of what we do Sunday morning. So you're competing and half the time with one hand tied behind your back based on the polity of your church and what authority you do or don't have and trying to please so many constituents. It's a very, very difficult role you have. But my experience, and I don't know if some of the others will, in your own experience, will map it out. In fact, Biola had, was it 5-6 years ago, it had a cover story on your alumni magazine or one of the magazines that talked about how men don't go to church anymore and why might that be. And it was a really insightful article. And my experience has been churches that put together what I call a faith and work ministry or a faith and work program, or where the pastor is constantly using workplace illustrations as well as other illustrations, you know, their summer vacation or whatever, that guess what? Men start going to church then. They go, wow, you're talking about my world. That's the world I live in. That is the place where I slave away. I need your help. So for those who embrace this faith at work, I do see there tends to be, appears to be a correlation between churches that are a bit more vibrant and churches that have a bit more men attending. And by the way, all the questions we're talking about, of course, pertain to men and women. That just happened to be a side observation about that. So we end up having this Sunday-Monday gap. This Sunday-Monday gap is what many people talk about. In my book, I talk about this Sunday-Monday gap. And frankly, it's not unique to Christians. It's the same thing if you're Jewish. You call it the Saturday-Monday gap. There's this dissonance. There's this gap. There's this space between our preaching and teaching in Sunday school and the world that people get sent back into on Monday. And the irony is that people want to talk about this. They want to hear, and we're not doing it. Let me just, out of curiosity, why do you think this Sunday-Monday gap exists? Any just random ideas? Yes, sir.
I think those in clergy train for that, and maybe have no idea of,
Yeah, so many clergy. In fact, out of curiosity, how many of you went more or less straight from college to seminary, and then your church? And then how many of you are second career people where you might have worked 5, 10, 15 years or something before? So a bit of a split. Yeah, for those who've not worked for a few years first and skinned their knees and had a couple body blows and some highs and joys which go with work, they may not do that. That's a reason many people say, research says that some clergy will feel a little bit intimidated. That particularly if they work in a sort of a well-heeled, affluent community, they may feel, frankly, a little uneasy with these people who just exude power and exude having it all, when in fact they're broken inside. They're as broke as anybody else. They just look better and have more trappings, more insulation, which isolates them. Any other ideas? Yeah, what do you think might be?
I think for me, my personal experience, my discovery, the Sunday Monday gap is, if it's on Monday, we pastor time for recovery from Sunday.
Yeah.
And so there's not much of a real Monday per se. And then Tuesday is spent getting ready for the next Sunday,
Yeah.
because Sunday pays for my Monday.
Yeah. That's very interesting. Yeah, I had never kind of thought of it that way. There's an asymmetric pattern between your work week and your parishioners' work week. And you got to make Sunday work or else no one comes. So, I mean, I'm not naive. I get that. Absolutely right. But the idea I want to put forward is maybe some of the stuff we'll be talking about today will help Sunday work even better. So,
Well, for me, the big disconnect is it's a failure to see the lordship of Christ. He's not only Lord of work, he's Lord of how you drive to work if you obey the limit. He's Lord of how you spend your money that you make from work. He's Lord of how you honestly pay your taxes.
Yeah.
So the whole thing is he's Lord of all, including your work time.
yeah. And so quick biblical question. Do you remember after the fall, Genesis, work is cursed, right? Ah, help me. You didn't fall into the trap. What's cursed? Not to put you in the spot.
Women.
But,
No, I don't.
Woo! Oh, man. Watch out. There's a lightning bolt going to come down here any moment. I'm moving over here. No, what's cursed is the ground we walk on. So work is never cursed. A lot of people, both clergy and lay folks, think that work is what's cursed in the Bible. Work is not cursed. Work is embraced and seen as a holy activity that can be done in ways to honor and please God. But it will now, after the fall, will now be done by the sweat of our brow. It's going to be harder. It's going to be harder. Yes, sir.
There seems to be a thinking out there that biblical principles don't work in the workplace.
Uh-huh.
That
Right.
they are too high up there, they're ideals, but they don't really work down here where we live.
Right, yeah, so it's nice in theory, but it ain't going to work in practice. Right. That's another obstacle. And we can sort of almost have a whole conversation on that, but I would suggest that while that is a certainly understandable piece, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't still strive towards it. I had a professor once who said, we always tend to think of the Ten Commandments as stuff we're not supposed to do, and like, okay, there's an element of that, but it's meant to be kind of a formula for a flourishing life. If you follow the prescriptions of the Ten Commandments, you'll have a better, healthier life. And I can tell you, I have met countless men and women, and in my own career too, that if you take kind of the high road and try to live according to Christian ethical standard, yeah, you will lose some business. Yeah, you will get taken advantage of sometimes, but over, as Martin Luther King used to say, over the arc of time, it works. But that doesn't mean you aren't going to get stepped on sometimes. But that's part of the Christian walk. And again, having people to help you through that. But that's great, thanks. Other reasons? Yes, sir.
think it's also a bit of evangelism because a lot of evangelism is church program based
Yeah.
and not marketplace based.
Yeah.
From like the urban church in China where people come to faith in the marketplace.
Yeah.
These are questions they always ask. What does my faith look like in marketplace?
Yeah. That's a terrific question. Another way I like to say is, how do you operationalize your faith? And we're going to hear some stuff from Mike later this afternoon, but what's it look like to be a person of faith and to take it to work? Is it little blinking lights on our forehead saying, I'm a Christian? Or is it never mentioned, but somehow we behave differently? What's it look like? It's a huge question. Yes, sir.
I think it has to do with our theology and our training.
Yeah.
Because a lot of our pastors are trained with certain type of theology, and it feels like the Bible, in a very limited way, becomes the solution to life's problems, and we rarely explore anything outside of that, and we rarely consult the context
Yeah.
of the church. The church should be in a certain context, and yet we don't explore that.
I think you're exactly right. In my book, God at Work, I'm frankly a little bit rough on the church, my own tribe as well, Presbyterians, that the seminary system in general, as a broad generalization, has really done a disappointing job over the past few decades of training clergy and pastors to think about this Sunday-Monday gap and to have a solid theology of work. And there are very few courses offered on a solid theology of work, a solid theology of creation, fall, redemption. What does it mean to be called to the workplace? So yeah, in fairness to all of us, no one taught it to us. So we kind of just go do business as usual when it's this huge gap in our theological equipping. Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Well, you first, then we'll go in the corner.
Yeah, I think the problem is theological too. The whole sacred, secular distinction in our thinking. So ministry, pastors have a call, and then even when we don't espouse that theology, it still informs a lot of our thinking, a lot of our preaching. These other things are second class.
Boy, you just nailed it. I don't know if you all heard the sacred secular split, and that pastors have a call. We all tell us called to preach at age 13 or whatever it might be in your tradition, and everybody else, you're all second class. We somehow have this really sloppy theology of calling, don't we? Where at the bottom we're sort of like a wretched, unsaved sinner, and then maybe you're a saved sinner, and then maybe you start going to church, maybe you get baptized, maybe you join the deacon or board of elders, whatever, and then when you're really climbing up the hierarchy of God's chosen people, you become called to preach, become ordained, become a pastor. And what's the ultimate in a bad Christian theology of calling? Yeah, a foreign missionary, no less, right? And golly, that's just the wrong way to think about it, isn't it? But we sort of slip into that. And without realizing it, we often, through our preaching and teaching, send messages to those very people who we're trying to assist, and back to our title here, prepare them for their Monday through Friday lives. We send them a message, your work really isn't as important as being a Sunday school teacher, or whatever it might be. Do you want to commence there?
Yeah, I think our problem is we've been successful without doing it.
Huh.
Ways that we define success.
Yeah, very interesting. So it doesn't seem to be a felt need because things are going pretty well anyway. Interesting. Very interesting. Yeah, so.
Yeah, as a pastor, I'm starting a church, and I sort of feel like my business is to make things go. So I get confused on what my real calling is.
Uh-huh.
So then I kind of view all of the potential parishioners as helping my business go versus helping them do the business of God throughout the week, helping the kingdom grow.
Yeah.
And so it's almost like I'm trying to say, okay, here, come help me be successful versus how can I?
Well, I really appreciate your candor in that, because that really frames it well. And maybe what it means is, for some of us, if these sort of questions resonate with you, it's almost a fundamental reframing. What does it mean to run a church? And what is the mission of the church, your particular church, as well as sort of the church writ large? And if you come to the conclusion that one of the things it ought to be doing is equipping the saints, equipping people for daily ministry in life, then if you get there, then there's a whole series of readjustments that might need to be made. It doesn't mean you still don't want to shoot the lights out Sunday and still got to be a great sermon and a great everything else, but it's in service of something different. So I really appreciate your candor. One more, and then I want to go on to some stuff. Let's go way to this side, because I've been sort of leaning left. Not politically, not interested. Yes, sir.
So building on these ideas that you mentioned of calling and the sacred-secular divide, is in the churches we'll talk about spiritual gifts, but we don't talk about gifts more broadly and their association with vocational calling.
Yeah.
And we get mixed up in how we teach our children to be successful. And we may talk about being successful in economic terms, we may talk about being successful in terms of Christian ethics, but there are many people that I've encountered in the workplace who are really struggling and unhappy because they've missed their calling, and they're trying to work ethically in an area where they are not gifted. And so this idea of training our children to associate their giftedness with vocational calling, I think, is a very important place to start.
Yeah, and that's a really helpful contribution. I can't tell you how many phone calls or meetings I'll have with business people who will say, you know, I was an art major in college, and now I'm vice president of sales, or I'm selling hedge funds or derivatives or whatever. Like what happened? Where did I go wrong? And that doesn't necessarily mean they did go wrong, but there's a dissonance. They're trying to connect. And for some, it means returning maybe to who they once were. And for others, it might mean reframing running a hedge fund or selling derivatives to figure out how can that be done honorably. So calling is a huge issue, yeah. And I don't think we do enough to help people think about what does it mean to be called, whether it's to wear a collar as a clergy person or to be in the marketplace in some capacity. One of the ways that I think about this is, we won't have time today, but the whole seminary world could be a big fix if the seminaries paid better attention to this, or, as you raised, but we won't have time to go into that. But I want to show a short video as a transition to then talking about something I call the integration box, which is a tool or resource I've been working on for a while, which might give you some handholds for your own preaching, teaching, etc., as well as something that might help your parishioners. So this is a video that I've not prepared it. It's on YouTube. It's loaded with theology. It's only about 2 or 3 minutes. So if you don't mind teeing this up, Ryan, and enjoy the film, please.
Work. Most of us spend over half our lives at work. Whatever it is you fill the 9 to 5 with, planting crops, building cars, taking care of patients, teaching students, or running a business, work is where most of life happens. For some, work is a drain. They dread Monday mornings, forcing themselves to struggle through because they need the paycheck, while many times feeling trapped and beaten down by their job. Some people love their work. They're good at what they do. It energizes them. It's a place of security, a place to chase dreams, desires, and success. At work, they find fulfillment. We often forget to connect our faith to our work. We don't consider the reasons God may have us at our job. We don't think about the purpose and meaning we could bring to our work. We simply focus on how it makes us feel. But what if we saw our work as an opportunity to worship? As Christians, we are called to serve Christ with our lives. For a few, that means working as a pastor, a youth minister, or a missionary. Others serve the church by teaching children or singing in the choir. But when Sunday is over, most of us return to our jobs outside the church. For us, our mission is in the marketplace. We may not be the kind of missionary who moves to the far regions of Africa, but around the conference table, around the water cooler, around the cubicle, we have an opportunity to worship the God who created us. He gave us skill. He gave us passion. He gave us work. When we do our jobs with excellence and integrity and diligence, it's an act of worship. We are displaying God's craftsmanship to the non-believing world around us. We are earning the right to be heard. We don't see a divide between Sunday and Monday, between the sacred and the secular. We've been invited into parts of the world that a pastor or a traditional missionary will never see. We have conversations with people who would never set foot in a church. Whether we love or dread our work, We choose to turn the focus away from ourselves and toward the mission God has for us. Church is not the only place we worship, and Sundays are not the only days on our calendars that have meaning. Every day on mission for God brings us great joy. Like the heroes before us, we can be modern-day Noahs and Josephs and Peters who are called with a purpose. God has designed us. He created us to work and to worship. For us, work is worship.
Thanks, Ryan. Reactions to that? A fast artist, yeah. This RSA animations are great, aren't they? Yes, sir.
Reminds me of Paul, who was actively in the world of making tents and also his own hands creating revenue, and at the same time, one of the most dynamic leaders of the church.
Yeah, yeah. Recollection of Paul, the tent maker, as we call him. Yeah, yeah. Yes, sir.
It reinforces the Old Testament concept of worship being service.
Yeah.
It's work.
Exactly. Some of you, I can't remember if it was mentioned in my bio that in parallel, so my day job is at Princeton where I teach and run the center and conduct research on faith and work. But I do some advisory work through something called the Avodah Institute. And you've just landed on that. Do you remember when you took your Hebrew lessons way back when in seminary and you're all struggling through your Hebrew vocab lists? I don't have epiphanies often in life. God tends not to send me too many emails. But one time my whole life came together in one word, and there's the Hebrew word avodah, or abodah, based on how you want to pronounce it. And it's still in modern Hebrew as well as ancient biblical Hebrew. And it means, the root word means three different things. It means work, as to work in the fields, to work at a job, to labor. It means to worship, as in worshiping Yahweh, the King of Kings. And it also means to serve. Remember that great verse? But as for me and my house, we will avodah the Lord. So that one word captures up this ancient Hebrew word, this deep theological meaning that the Old Testament is very switched on to. And if you talk to some of your Jewish friends, they're very alert to that Judaism has a very healthy appreciation for the work world and the importance of being ethical and honorable in your dealings. And work is a very central part of Jewish theology. And sometimes in Christian circles, based on the era and the time in which we live, we sometimes have slipped away from those underpinnings and foundations we have. But indeed, even if you look at the New Testament, you'll see Jesus is obviously told a lot more, but the Bible captured 40, nice biblical number, captured 40 different parables he taught that are recorded. And of those 40, go back and look at them, over half of them are about or take place in the marketplace, the then definition of the marketplace. He talks about and compares the kingdom of God almost to a factory floor. It's extraordinary. So, yeah, so thanks for, work, worship, service. One word. I'll spell it if you're curious. The word is avodah. Work, worship, service. Any other just quick reactions to the video? Sir, thumbs up? Yeah. Yeah, it's pretty amazing. It's pretty amazing. So, yeah, it's called Work as Worship on YouTube. And there's one or two that may come up that aren't it, but there's what they call these RSA things. It's easy to find. I mean, think of that alone, playing that at a Sunday school thing, or I don't know how you all do your adult education or something like that. Well, couldn't you have an extraordinary conversation with people, build a 4-part series around it? You could unpack it. And every time, and I've watched this dozens of times, each time I see something new, the theological ideas in this. I like how it elevates work, but doesn't overly glorify, because work is sometimes hard. You know, there are a lot of people in minimum wage jobs who are just barely getting by. Their work is horrible. They work for someone who's difficult, and they're challenging. There's other people who can't wait to get to work because they're just aligned. Their work is aligned with their sense of meaning and purpose. It's all over the map. So one of the things that I have been working on with a colleague from Wartburg College, Professor Tim E. West, he's in the business school there, and my research associate at Princeton University, someone named Jonathan Lee, it picks up on an idea that I started at the end of this book. When I was trying to research the Faith at Work movement, and by the way, it is a movement. It's a bona fide movement. Movement is different than a fad or a trend or something just popular, ebbs and flows like pet rocks or something. Meets the sociologist's, an academic sociologist criteria of a social movement, like the feminist movement, the black movement, LGBT movement. Pick what you want, but things that change the face of community and society. Well, the Faith at Work movement is one of those. And Doug and I think we first met, we were trying to remember 10, 12 years ago, and we were sort of smiling and saying, yeah, this stuff has legs. It didn't just blow away. And there are now bazillions of Dougs and Davids, when in the early days there was just sort of a handful of us in it, sort of dedicating our whole lives and professions to this. But there's a lot of energy happening in this Faith at Work space. And as I was trying to study it, one of the things I struggled with, well, what's my theological frame or context for this movement out there? There's men and women who are meeting at Starbucks, they're meeting in conference rooms at offices, they're going off to 5-star resort hotels, very elite high-end CEOs and senior executives, all talking about how do I connect the dots between Sunday and Monday? How do I make meaning and sense of all that God has given me to be a steward of? So this movement is all over. It crosses gender, it crosses race, it crosses denominations, Catholics and Protestants and Jews sometimes sitting down together, Buddhists. I mean, a lot of people are thinking about this. So I struggled with a framework to try to figure, well, is it left or right? Is it conservative or liberal, mainline evangelical? And I found all those categories, frankly, too loaded and lacking in any helpful way to understand this sort of this topography. So I wanted to kind of analyze it, which is what the book does. And I came up with something called the integration box. So this movement is being driven by people who want to live an integrated life. They want to live a holistic, integrated life. They don't want to live a bifurcated life or a compartmentalized life where they're one person on Sunday and they're another person on Monday. They want to live a holistic life, which, surprise, surprise, that's a very strong part of a Christian worldview, isn't it? So here I came up with 4 categories or 4 ways that I think but the research has borne out are the 4 different categories or ways that people try to integrate their faith and work. And I'm going to put the categories up, talk briefly about them, and then tell you something we've done with this. We've built a psychometric scale, an instrument where, well, I'm getting ahead of myself, but how many of you have taken Myers-Briggs, MBTI? Of course, everyone has, right? Or equivalence. Another real popular one, Strength Finders. Some of you read that in the airport, sort of focusing on positive psychology, not just what are our weaknesses, what are our strengths. So we've put together an instrument, working with Tim and my research associate Jonathan, where you could take the survey, take this instrument, and it will tell you what your natural predisposition is as far as how you, Steve, integrate faith and work, or how I integrate faith and work. And the theory is, and now research has borne it out, that we all have a preference, a natural voice, just like these other personality typings. And it doesn't mean the other categories are wrong, it just means we have a preference. So we'll talk about, so what are the 4 types? Because I'm kind of, like to keep things simple, I use mnemonics, so that they all begin with the E. They call the 4 E's in this integration box. The 4 E's. And sometimes you'll hear me refer to the integration box as TIB, T-I-B, just for short. So the 4 E's, what do you think might be 4 different ways that people manifest? I think somebody used the phrase, how do you operate? Like, what's your faith look like at work? How do you manifest your faith to work? How do you bring your faith to work? How do you operationalize your faith to work? 4 different ways. To get us going, I'll say the first one. The first E is ethics. To be a person of faith, certainly the Christian tradition, but other traditions as well, means to be a person of your word. Honest, fair dealings, fair weights and measures and scales. To be ethical. In the Old and New Testament, there are umpty-ump passages and narratives and teachings that remind us that part of the Christian duty in the work world is to be ethical. Even if it costs us, which is a point a couple of you made, which it will sometimes. And as I looked at the ethics, I saw two sort of sub-orientations or sub-manifestations as I think about ethics. One is at the level of the self, and the other is at the level of the community. What do I mean by that? A lot of folks I know, their own personal probity, they would never cheat on an expense account. They would never fudge a report. They would never bow to pressure that might come on high. They're always going to do the right ethical thing, even if it costs them their job. So that's what I would call ethical self. Ethical community is someone who may also still be ethical self, but they're interested in the bigger picture, social issues. What about offshore manufacturing? What about sweatshops? What about minimum wage? What about health insurance? They're looking at sort of social, structural questions through an ethical lens, which, oh, by the way, the prophets did an awful lot of that, didn't they? Go back to Amos and all those great people. So two different ways. So many people, if you ask them what's it mean to bring your faith to work or integrate your faith to work, they're going to really resonate with ethics. And they may not have the vocabulary for it, but the ethics would be their first voice. What do you think another one that begins with E is? That'd be the second E we'll talk about. I like it, but that's not it. That's an excellent answer. Yeah, I heard someone say evangelism. So I'm going to phrase it differently. Instead of saying evangelism, and I know this is a Christian audience, and we're a Christian gathering at a school that is founded in Christian principles, so we're speaking in Christian vocabulary, but this instrument that I've developed is one that is designed to work with people regardless of their religious tradition, so that you could be part of a religious tradition that does not believe in sharing your faith, and they could still take this instrument and find their voice. So I call it expression instead of evangelism, because evangelism leaves out some religious traditions. But in other words, how do you express your faith at work? And you, as a Christian, you might see the synonym as being evangelism, but expression, how do you express it? And here, again, all these four E's have two subcategories. And these two may not surprise you. One I call verbal, and one I call nonverbal. There are some people whose orientation, whose theological accent is to make sure they're telling people of who and what they believe and why, and wanting other people to share in that view. Some do it with words, some do it non-verbally. It may also be a matter of attire. Think of Muslim people who have certain garb that they may be required to wear. So how you express your faith at work is another manifestation, or do you kind of hide it? Do you not go there? Now let's think of some stereotypes. If you think of, I'm from the Northeast, right? The God-forsaken Northeast, right? So the stereotype would be that a Northeasterner might be really interested in ethics, but really be very uncomfortable with expression. And there's probably some resonance with that based on what tradition. There's other traditions that you grow up, say in the South or other places where it's all about work as a mission field. It's all about leading people to know who Jesus Christ is. That's the only thing that faith and work integration is about. Well, I want to suggest that there are different modalities. So we have these two. The third one we've touched on a little bit, I call experience. And by experience, I mean, it's essentially calling, vocation, vocatio. How do you experience your work? Do you experience your job, your work, as just a job to pay the rent? Sort of has no intrinsic value or purpose. It's just instrumental, helps you pay the rent, your mortgage or whatever. Or is there something about being called to that work? Is there something noble, holy, purposeful, and with meaning about that work you're doing? And whether it's humble work of sweeping the streets, remember that great quote from Martin Luther King Jr. that may you sweep the streets as Michelangelo painted the pictures. So no matter how humble or holy or big your work is, can it have meaning and purpose? So for people who feel called to their work, led to their work, for many of them, their first or their residence, if you say, so what does it mean to integrate faith and work? You say, well, this is where I'm meant to be. My work gives me meaning and purpose. I know I'm making the world a better place. I'm moving the needle. They could see the big picture. And the two sort of subcategories that I use under experience is there are some who focus on the task at hand or the process in which they're doing it. In other words, they are an excellent carpenter. They are an excellent plumber. They are an excellent surgeon. They're an excellent stock analyst. The actual task, they're really, really, really good at it. And they get great joy because they're lined up with what they're good at. They're a problem solver. Or the experience or calling people could be ones who've really focused more on outcomes. I do a lot of work with a company called Tyson Foods. Some of you will know them. 1 in 4 meals that we eat today that has protein in it, beef, poultry, and pork, is made by Tyson Foods. You think of them typically often just in the poultry business. And I've been on their plants and lines of people plucking chickens, eviscerating animals. That's hard, dangerous, difficult work. But some of the people we've surveyed actually say that while they don't necessarily like the specific task they're doing, it's their entry into often they're immigrants, it's the first job they've had, but they're treated honorably, and that's huge, but they understand they're helping to feed the world. So some of them may actually show up as, no, I feel called to this work. It's helping me feed my family. Yeah, there's an instrumental dimension, but I'm feeding the world too with safe products at reasonable prices. So experience or calling is, for many people, really important. The final and fourth E is sometimes a little harder for me to describe. I call it enrichment. Enrichment. The first three, in many ways, are sort of outward-looking, not completely, but outward-looking, whereas enrichment is inward-looking. It's tending to the matters of the soul. It's how we, it's the person, in fact, back at Service Master, a very early version of this instrument, the first prototype, I had the Service Master senior leadership team take this test instrument. It was very rudimentary at that point. And the CFO at the time, a woman as her chief financial officer, said, you know, because I explained the model in advance, and she said, I know I'm going to be ethics. That's me. I am all about, man, it's in or it's out, it's right or it's wrong. I'm the CFO, for heaven's sakes. But when she took the instrument, she concluded actually enrichment was her first preference or voice. Why? Because she would get up a half hour early before the rest of her family and do a Bible study or do a devotional. And that centered her. It grounded her. And that gave her the strength then to sometimes fight against forces that would have her take different views of things. So think of enrichment as tending, sort of the balm in Gilead. It's tending to the soul. Some of you will have parishioners who work in really, frankly, dysfunctional companies or difficult places to work where their boss steals credit for them, or they have a coworker who's stabbing you in the back. And enrichment, this is the person who is more contemplative in nature, more prayerful in nature, and it's the internal matters of the soul. This is the kind of person, and here I split the two subgroups up here as two different ways of thinking about it. There's either individual ways, individual, or group ways that these people bring their faith. Or the group might be someone who says, you know, I'd like to form a fellowship group at our place of work, and let's pray together for our company. Let's pray together for our people. Let's pray together for the issues we know we're struggling and facing. And other people really have more of a personal orientation, where that might be the person who does something privately in the morning. So this integration box is now at a stage where we have it such that you can go online and take it as an instrument either to fill out for yourself, to say what's my natural voice, what's my natural predisposition, and also a version that we're doing at an aggregate level, so a whole organization, a whole company can say, well, gee, do we notice any patterns or correlations? We did this with a company up in Canada. By the way, the instrument, for those of you who follow this stuff and some of the academics in the room, we're at that blessed stage where the instrument is deemed valid and reliable. And for those of you who are statisticians, that is super hard to do. This isn't just a questionnaire. To have a valid and reliable instrument, you get a lot of gray hairs doing that. And luckily, Timmy U.S., my colleague at Wartburg, is a lot smarter than me. He's done all the heavy lifting and the analytics. So this passes all the sort of the scholarly test of a legitimate model. Valid and reliable is the terminology they use. We had one D-Min student he's 50 years old or so, is getting his D-Min, and he was intrigued by this model, and he had invited his whole congregation to take the model. And what he wanted to find out, so he didn't know at the individualized level of like, you said this, but at an aggregate level, he wanted to find out, did his congregation have a natural voice or predisposition? And he found out in his particular case that they were all over expression, so it was a church that really accented evangelism. And he found out that they were talking very little about ethics. And while there's nothing wrong with focusing on any one of these, he realized as a pastor, he kind of had one of those aha moments of, wow, I'm only feeding one kind of meal to my parishioners. I should be thinking about this wider way of thinking of work. So he then, and others, and some ideas I'm playing with, he's trying to use this as a filter. So for every sermon, what kind of illustrations is he using? What kind of stories is he telling? Which sort of biblical passages is he preaching on? And he's thinking, am I going through all four of these categories? And if not, maybe we ought to challenge ourselves to pay a bit more attention to some of these other categories. And you can kind of see it and go, oh, I get it. I get it. We're also having starting to mention a company up in Canada took this. They wanted to see if there's any correlations between certain client-facing positions in the company, if that might, if there would be a certain draw. And this was a very kind of like a little United Nations. I mean, they had Buddhists, they had Christians, they had atheists, they had everything. And they wanted to see if people who have a predisposition towards enrichment or calling or experience, if they might be better in certain roles in the company. So there's some interesting corporate applications of this with policies and what you embrace with policies and practices. Let me just pause a minute because I've kind of thrown a lot out on this integration box with the TIB and its 4 E's. What are some of your reactions to it and or questions, if I can clarify, if I haven't explained it well? Yes, sir.
On the Canadian company you just mentioned, are they far enough along in their analysis to notice any pattern?
They are, and as it happens, this is it's a business of I'm going to call it nursing homes, but it's not. It's assisted living facilities. Assisted living facilities. They've got about 14 or 15 different villages or locations, and they're trying to look at. So they've got IT staff, they've got operations people, but they also have those who deal with the actual residents. And are there certain attributes that might be more or less? There could be a logical alignment, and they haven't finished doing all the analysis, but they did find some things jumped out that could be of interest. And again, it was done on aggregate, so there's no individual. You obviously have to be sensitive with all these things when you do a survey and a psychometric scale of any sort to make sure you're not misusing it in a corporate context. But yeah, it does seem to be bearing something out. Yes, sir.
I think this is so practical. I think that I've heard the term workplace ministry quite a bit. I've read books and heard different things about it, but the way you break this down, I think it's practical for someone to say, how do I want to do workplace ministry?
Yeah.
This is how I can do it, as opposed to, here I am on my job, what do I do?
Yeah. And if I go, like you go to a party, you're invited somewhere, whether it's a ball game or a dinner party or barbecue, and someone says, what do you do? And I say, well, I'm in the God business. And they go, what? And when I say I'm interested in the connection of faith and work between one's Sabbath day and one's workplace, a lot of them will assume, oh, you mean proselytizing, you mean evangelizing. And I'll say, well, a bit, but there's other stuff too. My theology, there may be different theologies in the room, and I want to respect that, but my theology says that a full and mature Christian life needs to be attentive to all four of these. And the reality is we could find different ways of scales and frameworks, but I've found these four to be pretty inclusive. And if you go back, and maybe some of you are doing this in your head, if you go back in Old and New Testament, you will find all these are biblically valid. They are doctrinally legitimate. These are orthodox categories. God is interested in all of these. So, yeah, to your point, practical, it seems to, as I've been taking this around out of different companies and academic conferences and churches, that it sort of passes the sniff test, and it's not overly complicated. I mean, we can make it really sophisticated, and a lot of that's behind the engine. But as far as how I think about my preaching, my teaching, and how I talk with people, it really expands the horizon. And let's face it, some of us are not gifted at some of these things. How many people we say, well, I don't know how to talk about God in public. I'm really uneasy with that. Well, okay. And then they think they're a failure, and they think they haven't brought their faith to work, and they feel guilty their whole life. When in fact, maybe that person is doing excellent work. They're doing excellent work, and they're the best person. They've honored God through their excellent work. But this is a personal story. My wife has multiple sclerosis, MS, so we spend a lot of time on the phone with insurance claims and insurance people. And I tell you, I value the person who enters the data incorrectly the first time. We spent once, it was about 2 years ago, I calculated up over 60 person hours trying to correct a stupid mistake that was the front end of the problem. And I'm sure you've had your versions of that with insurance companies or a bank or whatever. So excellent work matters. Ethics matters. Other thoughts or reactions to the model? Yes, sir.
In the experience category,
Yeah.
is it, when it says some focus on the task at hand, they're really good at it, is what you're getting at that they experience satisfaction because of their skill, or that they actually see that thing that they're doing as something that matters to them?
Yeah, it's a great question. If you heard it, is in the experience or what we might call calling, there's a task and outcomes. For many people, these aren't mutually exclusive. You could be both. And for some people, they see the actual task at hand, what they're doing. Some can put it into a bigger end game and understand how this helps society, how this pleases God, how this makes for a better social order in which we live. Others, frankly, don't, and they're just in the zone because they're really, really good at that module they do. So it could be both. And it's one of the leadership challenges that I've put out to corporate folks is there's a whole body of literature, and I'm sure the business faculty here will be attentive to it. There's called engagement, and how do you engage your workforce? How do you get them to kind of be enthusiastic about coming to work every day and to buy in to what you're doing, or are they just punching the clock and getting in and out as soon as they can? And this is, I think, the whole experience thing. How can we create a work experience for people, even if they're doing really humble work, that they could see how it fits into the bigger picture, that maybe their work is a calling. By the way, these aren't mutually exclusive, if I wasn't clear. Unlike, say, Myers-Briggs, where you're either an introvert or you're an extrovert, it's either or. The theory behind this, the concepts and the theory behind this is that while we have a preference, they're not mutually exclusive. And also, and now this is a prescriptive opinion, my challenge to myself and to all in the Christian community is we ought to be attentive to all of these areas. And maybe we have one that we're naturally good at or naturally at home at or we feel comfortable, but we ought to challenge ourselves to be attentive in our discipleship in the areas that we just don't think about. Yes, sir. And then over there.
Is this expounded on in your book?
Yeah, so the book has, it sort of tees it up. It was the early days of the research, and it sort of gives some of the framework. In fact, my marketing friends tell me I shouldn't call it the integration box because it sounds like we're being boxed into something. I think I have a graphic in the book that shows spheres, almost like a Venn diagram of overlapping, and that's probably a better image, but I'm just sort of stuck on saying TIB. It sounds better than spheres. But yeah, so the book lays it out, and also if you go to our website at Princeton, there's a tab that talks about all the research we're doing and how we're taking it forward. And if some of you are interested, like that one D-Min student, not that you have to do a study on it, but if you're interested in profiling your own worship community, it could be a really interesting thing to do. Contact me and I'll have my research assistant work with you. We could set up a separate URL so because we want to build the number of people. So far, over 1,500 people have taken it. So we have a really great data set that's being built up, but we can have specifically identified pools take it. So they wouldn't get an individual report, but then you could see what your congregation looks like. So grab me afterwards, give me a business card or an email address or something if that's of interest to you. Yes?
Is it desire to have more of a balanced life, balanced approach by incorporating strictly strong points with the ones like
Could you say that again?
Give us an idea to focus within the realm of balancing those four areas.
Right. So here it's prescriptive. This is one guy's opinion, but my theology says that all four of these categories are biblically sound. And if I want to grow in my life as a mature believer, and I don't mean it in an arrogant way, but we all know that we can lift our game up, then I ought to challenge myself. I ought to recognize it's always good to be self-aware, recognize when I'm naturally good at it, keep doing it, and the areas that I'm not so good at, learn how to do it better, to broaden your space and your reach. Let's take the stereotypes. A lot of times, we were talking earlier about sort of evangelizing versus ethics, that, well, maybe you're all over the ethics and social justice questions, and that's great, and that's important, and that's good. But when was the last time you ever told someone what you believed and why? And that's a little, I'm starting to get uncomfortable. That's the whole point. Maybe we should be a little uncomfortable and stretch. And also the person who's running around doing a terrific job of evangelizing, but not really caring about social justice questions and feeding the widow, the orphan, the alien, the poor. Well, maybe we ought to be challenged, that person ought to be challenged to lift up some of their sights of what it means to be a disciple. And by the way, as I I'm sorry, as I...
Required class or an elective?
What's that?
Princeton, what you're doing there.
Oh, well, what I...
These guys
So I teach at the university, not the seminary. So when I was at Yale, I was teaching future clergy through the divinity school and future business people through the MBA, through Yale's MBA program, their School of Management. Princeton, I'm just teaching undergraduates, juniors, and seniors. I teach a course on Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a reading seminar, and I teach a course, the one I think you mentioned in the intro, Business Ethics, Succeeding Without Selling Your Soul. And there I look at, unlike this audience, which was sort of a self-selected Christian audience, at Princeton, of course, my students are all, they represent sort of the universe of religion. So I have everything from atheists and agnostics in my class to Catholics, Muslims, Jews, Protestants. It's really, really electric. And we talk about, and here we are at a secular research university, we talk about, not from a confessional point of view, that wouldn't be effective or appropriate, but from a descriptive point of view, we talk about what are the resources of the great religious traditions to help people be more ethical. So in that course, I tend to focus more on the ethics E, and to some extent, the experience E, a sense of work as a calling. And I do present this model to them. It's not the thrust of the course, but so they could see how it works. I know I'm going a little bit off your question, and I do some guest lecturing over at Princeton Theological Seminary where I'm talking to clergy. So second career clergy seem to intuitively kind of get it because they've kind of come out of that world. Many of them, frankly, were beat up and had a rough time and are really glad to get out of the so-called rat race, and whereas others really love and appreciate that space. But there's another group, just sort of a sidebar. It comes back to calling and expression and experience. And this is public knowledge. There's a group in Greenwich, Connecticut that I lead once a month called the Greenwich Leadership Forum. Some of you may know Greenwich. It's sort of the hedge fund capital of the world, and we get anywhere from 50 to 150 people that get together once a month for an early breakfast. About half the time I'll interview a CEO about how he or she integrates their faith and work, this sort of stuff. And about the other half of the time I take something from the Wall Street Journal and say what went on this week in the world that we should be thinking about, and how can our faith be a resource to equip us to be more ethical, more effective leaders. And we had our annual dinner, sort of fundraising dinner. We had about 250 people there, a lot of folks. And the person I interviewed, and this video is online, you go look at it, is the head of GE's China business. He's got 20,000 employees, and talk about one of the most fascinating, interesting places and jobs to have right now, to be running GE's China business. And he would tell you, and he said this in the interview, that he's not there just to run the business. He has a greater purpose. He knows he's there for other reasons as well. In addition to obviously having to run a really smart, good, effective, profitable business. Of course he has to do that. So this space of the ability, as that little video that we saw reminds us, that some of your parishioners will be able to go into halls of power or places of danger that we clergy will never have the opportunity to be in. And if we can equip them to be better at that when they go there, we've just done a huge multiplier effect. Sir?
Where do we find that? You know, so that's available?
Yeah, so if you Google Greenwich Leadership Forum, I think the website is greenwichleadershipforum.org. greenwichleadershipforum.org. And you'll see actually all the different interviews I've done. There's a variety of them. It just happens to be the most recent one that was on my mind. And what some people are doing, by the way, they're using those videos as conversation starters, again, for a church activity, a series, whether you do a multi-part program or series or a one-off thing. And some of them we've done sort of 5-minute best hits, and others we have the whole tape. And in like fashion, if you're interested in broadening the horizon, go to our Princeton website, where I also have been interviewing different CEOs and business leaders, and they're in keeping with my wider brief at the university. In addition to Christian leaders, there's Jewish leaders, a Muslim leader, because these are real questions for people of all faith traditions. How do you integrate your faith in your work? So if you're interested in a bit of a wider net, go to the Princeton website, and it's just Google Faith and Work Initiative, Princeton University Faith and Work Initiative, or my name, and it'll pop up.
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.